Good evening, fellow ghouls, and welcome to Undeth Consumes. I am Undeth, and tonight's story, titled One of Our Cattle Started Biting, should tell us that even in this modern era, there are still many mysteries to be solved, and this tale is one of them. So please, light a candle, sit back and relax as we prepare to begin. I live in a small, tight-knit rural community in the Scottish Highland Territories. I won't disclose exactly where. All you need to understand is how out of the way we are. Miles and miles of roads winding around endless hills, burns, and lochs separate us from the nearest town where any brand-name stores may operate. My parents are farmers, but in a more rustic sense. Think subsistence farming, with a little bit of good faith selling and trading with the nearest neighbours. In the north of Scotland, cell phone and internet coverage is unreliable at best anywhere outside of your own home. My aunt and my uncle visit now and then from Glasgow, and if I want anything, I can get it sent up there. We're not all that disconnected from modern-day technology and postage. I hope that this can give a little context towards my situation, a feel for where we are. We have some sheep and chickens, but mostly our pride and joy have been our cows. We keep them happy, and there's plenty of space for them to roam and have good lives. We genuinely care about them, my dad especially. After 50 years of heading the farm, he still hates to have them slaughtered. Big softy he is. Something most people don't know about cows is that they tend to stay in barns during the day, if they have the chance, and they head out to the pastures at night. One evening, about 2 weeks ago, we were at the table for a late dinner, when we heard one of the cows crying out, louder above the usual bustle. When a cow is in pain, or especially scared, it cries out in this weird, whining scream, high-pitched. My dad and I each gave each other a look and grabbed some flashlights and ran out into the field with our collie Kira to try and see what it was. When we reached them, the beams of the old flashlight swept across the scattered herd. Most of them were still moving and giving these scattered, little scared moos. No matter how long you work on a farm, it's always unnerving being out there at night. All those big animals with their eyes reflecting with this ghostly green glow. Quickly I spotted one amongst the herd, Nell, with a damp red glistening wound on the neck. My dad and I spent a little time getting closer to her, but it took a while because she was understandably skittish. Finally, getting a closer look, I felt my heart drop and my stomach churn when I saw it. A bite, and a big one. Another thing you need to know about Scottish cows is that they don't have any natural predators. Foxes are too small, and the wolves and bears died off decades ago. So nothing could have or should have done this. We heard Kira growling. Turning the flashlight to her, we saw her low to the ground, baring her teeth, face pointed toward the far corner of the field. We slowly turned our beams, and stood there, still as stone, was one of the cows. It was eerie, seeing it just standing there, unmoving and staring back at us. Caught in the light, it wasn't hard to see that its lips were damp and its chin was wet with blood. My dad looked at it, with its mouth partially open and its eyes narrowed. Placing a hand on my shoulder and stepping in front of me, it was Clarabelle, one of the larger of the herd, who was a couple of months into her pregnancy. We've never had aggression in our animals before, just the odd nip and shove. "She must be sick," muttered my father, before adding, "Take Kira inside." The words came through to me, but I felt frozen, as still as that cow. She was looking dead at me, those reflective eyes a sheer, pale green that bored into my soul, sent chills down my spine. I watched as a single red bead of blood trickled down her lips. My dad shook me softly, repeating himself a little more firmly, which woke me from my stupor. Nodding, I tore myself away from the cow's stare and pulled the disgruntled collie away and back towards the house. It was only on that return trip that I realized how hard my heart was beating, thumping in my chest. Something was off about this whole situation, and I hated having to leave my father alone back there. I told my mother what had happened and explained everything, leaving her as confused as me and my dad. Thankfully, it wasn't long before he came back in. He told us that he had gotten her back and locked her and the bitten one, Nell, in separate pens in the barn, away from the others. He'd call a vet and see if he could get the herd checked, in case there was some kind of a disease going about. Needless to say, I did not sleep easy that night. Laid in bed, and all I could think about was the look in its eyes, the intensity, and the intent I could feel behind it. I love animals, and I don't scare easily, but this felt different, felt wrong. After a good few hours of tossing and turning, struggling to keep the cows out of my mind, sleep finally took me. I woke with a start to the sound of my dad shouting from downstairs. Frantically, I rolled out of bed and shoved on some clothes, stumbling down the stairs with a nervous lump in my throat. For what could have happened now? It was early, a cold amber tinting the highlands from the sunrise peeking through the cloudy gray sky. The front door was lying open, so I hurried outside and spotted the herd standing in the middle of the field, looking towards the farmhouse, all making distressed, mooing sounds. I saw my mother stood in front of the open barn doors, covering her mouth with her hands, a look of shock in her eyes. Nervously, I stepped forward till I laid eyes on it too. The sight made my gut rise, my hand coming to grip on the barn door to support my legs, which felt as though they were going to give out from underneath me as I tried not to vomit. On the left side of the barn, the wooden stall separating Clarabelle from the cow she'd bitten had been smashed through, the wood splintered and broken. In the pen, Clarabelle stood over the mess that was Nell, mouth full of bloody meat. The dead animal's throat was torn open, her blood spattered across the wall and hay-covered floor from where it had been ripped out. It wasn't just that, though. Her stomachs were eaten into as well, a gaping hole where her gut was still warm and strewn with gore. And before I turned away, I was fairly certain I saw the part-way eaten body of a fetal calf amongst it all. The way she'd been moving to take each bite and swallow it was unnervingly quick and erratic. Nothing like a cow's usual lazy motions. I couldn't stomach another look. The sound of meat being torn and chewed by blunt teeth. The offensive, coppery smell of the blood filling my senses as I struggled not to hyperventilate. It was then that I heard my dad yelling, having grabbed a pitchfork and begun trying to force Clarabelle back from the body. and it took him physically prodding her to even get her to step back a little. Speaking loudly, he told my mother to call our neighbor Horace to come round and bring his rifle. She ran back from the scene in a hurry, but I was still frozen as I watched my dad shout and fend back the bloodied animal. Clarabelle swallowed with a gross gulping noise, and as soon as she had nothing left to chew, she moved forwards again towards the corpse. My dad yelled at her, thrusting forward the pronged pitchfork to scare the cow back, but she completely ignored him. She was strong, the strength behind her movements knocking the makeshift weapon out of my father's hands as she forced her way back to the corpse of Nell. When she finally reached it, she immediately bit down again into the pit of the dead cow's stomach. But when she opened her mouth, it was wider than I'd ever seen a cow's mouth open before. She made some horrid noise, like someone with a hoarse breath breathing inwards. My father took a few slow steps back, watching in horror as the terrible feeding continued. I was still stood in the doorway of the barn while this was happening, and glancing back to the house, I could see my frantic-looking mother looking out the window at us from the kitchen, on the phone talking to someone who I guessed would be Horace. I heard my dad mutter something, drawing my attention back towards the broken stalls. He'd gone pale, a look of confused disgust and fear on his face. I looked to follow his gaze, and saw it too. I felt the breath leave my shaking body, limbs and chest growing cold. I'd mentioned before that Clarabelle was pregnant, but we could see her belly distending. It was moving, shifting as if something were pressing against it from the inside, her abdomen becoming visibly larger and the skin thinner as she fed. But the thing pressing against her from the inside, it didn't look like a calf. It looked like an arm, a hand pushing outward for a moment. I took a few faltering steps back, but my dad turned to me and began storming away from the scene, moving past me and marching to the storage shed. When he re-emerged, he was carrying a jerry can of petrol, and the look on his face was terrifying. It was this God-fearing anger, like he was hellishly intent on righting what we could both see was so wrong. He walked right past me into the barn and immediately began splashing it on Clarabelle and the stalls, the sound of her horrid, breathy crunching and swallowing still permeating the chamber, the thing in her stomach still growing and convulsing. The smell of petrol and blood mixed potently as my dad emptied the can into a trail that led past where I stood and a few feet away from the barn. He closed the doors, pulled the latch, locking it, and then lit a match. He hesitated for just a second, looking at me as if to check that what was happening was real. All I could give him in return was a pale-faced, pleading expression. He dropped the match, which lit an instant tall flame, following the trail of gasoline quickly with a dull crackling roar, right up to and under the slight gap beneath the barn doors. It was full of hay and dry wood in there. We both knew that soon enough it would be engulfed, along with whatever was inside. I stepped back as it intensified, feeling the heat coming off of it, and watching the smoke billowing upwards. I could feel this tension in my chest, like I was waiting for something to happen. But even as I smelt burning meat, the pained bovine cries that I expected never came. As I was about to let out the breath I had been holding, A sudden ungodly shrieking started. I ran. I ran away as the sound burst forth from the flaming barn, even as my dad stood firm outside the barred doors. I ran as I heard the pained mix of animal and human wailing from inside the inferno. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran inside of the house and straight to the bathroom, dropped in front of the toilet, and I vomited. It was hours before the fire burned out. There was nothing left of the barn but the charred wood and ash and the bones of the cows. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel safe out here again, especially after my dad told me something. Something that I will never forget as long as I live. He saw something escape the fire. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please click like and subscribe, as I will be uploading more scary stories soon. Sleep tight, fellow ghouls, and fear not the darkness. Until next time.